everyone. Welcome to week 4 of remote learning. We are going to be covering pretty much an overview of the Civil War, kind of like a little crash course of the Civil War. So maybe going through the PowerPoint slides that I required you to read and kind of give a little bit of explanation on them. I'm not making you read all of them, and again, I'm just giving you a brief overview of the war. Like, I could spend a whole month just talking about this war. But since we're only going to focus on the major battles and kind of what went on with the war, I'm just going to do a crash course for you. So we're going to start on this slide. Last week, you kind of learned the strengths and weaknesses of both sides at the beginning of the war, who kind of the leaders were, and what was kind of happening. So now we're talking about the strategies for winning the war. So the Union, or the North's plan to win the war, was they were to use their navy to blockade the southern ports so that trade between other countries, the South and the other countries, couldn't trade with each other because the navy, the North's navy, was blockading that port. And again, an advantage of the Union is they have ships and they have a strong navy compared to the South. And also in the east side of the South, they wanted to take over the Confederate capital, which was located in Richmond, Virginia. They thought that was key. If they could take Richmond, they would win the war because that was the capital of the Confederacy. And in the west side, they wanted to take control of the Mississippi River because the South was using that river to transport goods, supplies, and people. And if the Union controlled the Mississippi River, then the South would be cut off in 2 different areas. And Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana would be cut off from the rest of the Confederate States of America. And they wanted to keep the Confederates from using this river to supply troops and send supplies down. So they wanted to take the control of the Mississippi. The Confederate plans were to fight a defensive war until Northerners were tired of fighting and gave up. So they weren't going to try to invade in the North. They were just going to stay put, fight on the defensive side, and just wait till the Northerners give up. And they wanted European support. They were trying to get different countries in Europe to support them, and they were to use European money and supplies to help fight this war. And the Southerners expected Europeans to help them and to recognize the Confederacy as an independent country. So those were the 2 plans for both sides to win the war. And also, both sides thought this war was going to last a couple months, but it lasted 4 long, bloody years where many people died. So I'm going to show you 2 different battles that happened early on in the war. And people were hoping, again, for a quick end to the war, but obviously that was not the case. And the North and South kind of realized that after a couple battles that they fought with each other. So one battle is the Battle of Bull Run. It happened in 1861 on July 21st. The main thing you need to know about this battle is that Lincoln sent troops to attack Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy, and Union and Confederate troops, they clashed together and kind of fought each other between D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. And the Union troops retreated because they were so unprepared. Actually, some speculators were shocked by the battle. A lot of them actually rode out to watch the Union Army crush the Confederates. People that were from D.C. went out to kind of see the battle. They brought picnic baskets. They thought it was like a cheery thing. They were spread out on this like hilltop overlooking Bull Run, and they were shocked to see what was happening. And the results of it was Lincoln appointed a new commander of the Union Army of the East, and his name is General George McClellan. In the end, he turned out to be too cautious, and Lincoln did not like him. And in March 1862, another battle that happened was McClellan's troops moved towards Richmond, and at this, Robert E. Lee, who is the commander of the Confederacy, attacked McClellan's troops because McClellan is too slow and too cautious compared to E. Lee, who is a great commander, and he knows the game, and he knows how to plan things out. And at the same time, Robert E. Lee sent his famous general, and his nickname is Stonewall Jackson, because people said he stood his ground like a stone wall. His name is actually Thomas Jackson, but he got the nickname Stonewall Jackson. It just stuck. And Lee sent Stonewall north to threaten Washington, D.C. And with D.C. threatened, Lincoln did not want to send the rest of the Union Army to help McClellan, so McClellan had to retreat, which wasn't a good thing. Two other battles is the Monitor and the Merrimack, or Virginia, if you want to call it, happened in 1862. The Confederates, they covered a Union warship, which was the Merrimack, that the Union just left behind, and they wrapped it with iron plates and renamed it the Virginia. And the Union decided to build something similar, and it's called an ironclad, is what the ship is kind of called, where these iron plates wrap around to kind of help barricade if you're fighting in the water using cannons and gun ammunition. And the two vessels fought near Virginia, and this was the first battle of the ironclad ships, and neither vessel was seriously damaged because of the iron plates, and both withdrawn from the battle. However, ironclad ships, they changed naval warfare. So because of those two ships fighting each other, and that they had the iron plates around, they now changed how the Navy fought on the sea. And then the Battle of Antietam, which happened in September 1862. Lee was hoping for a Southern victory on Northern soil. This battle happened in Maryland. Lee marched his men into Maryland, and McClellan, he got access to Lee's plans. They were kind of left behind, and the troops kind of saw it. So McClellan learned of his plans, what Lee was doing, but again, he's too cautious, and he was too slow to attack. But at last, the two sides, they finally met and fought. Both sides lost a lot of men. Many men were wounded because of this, and there wasn't a clear victor because Lee withdrew, and because of that, Northern morale was raised. People were kind of giving hope that the North could win this. Lincoln, however, was mad at McClellan for his slow tactics, his cautious nature, retreating his troops. Did not like that. He wanted a strong person on the job. So he decided to replace McClellan with this guy, Ambrose Burnside. And if you see a picture of this guy, he has the weirdest mustache situation going on. He's actually the one that they started using the term sideburns, because it would go from his ear to ear would be his facial hair. Look up a picture of him. It's wild, this guy, Ambrose Burnside. So far, the North isn't doing that good of a job trying to win these battles, and they kind of realize that they have to get their act together. They need to have a commanding leader in place of the army, and this doesn't help the Union out at all with these two victories that were under the belt of the Confederacy. So in December 1862, Lee's forces met Burnside's army, and the battle is known as the Battle of Fredericksburg. And Lee forces, they dug into this hill. So they kind of made like a little tunnel thing, if you want to, whatever you want to call it. And when the Union troops started charging the Confederates, they were kind of shielded with that little tunnel or protection, whatever you want to call it. And they were shooting way after all of the different Union troops. So wave after wave of Union troops charged the Confederate guns, mowed them down. Burnside just kept making the Union troops going after them. And this was one of the Union's worst defeats, because of Burnside realizing, hey, we should retreat, because the Confederates have the upper hand with that protection, and when the Union's charging them, they're protected by that crest in the hill, and they're just mowing them down. And in 1863, in May, the Battle of Chancellorsville was another victory for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, who's also aided by Stonewall Jackson, his right-hand man. Stonewall Jackson, you do not want to mess with. This man is brilliant. He's a great general. He knows the game. And they outmaneuvered the Union forces in a very wooded area. And Lee and Jackson defeated the Union troops in a 3-day battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville. Sad thing is, Stonewall Jackson lost his life because of this battle. And that kind of left Lee down because Stonewall Jackson was like his right-hand man. And someone on the Confederate side thought Stonewall Jackson was a Union soldier, so they shot at him, and Jackson died soon after that wound. He never recovered, and he died after the battle. So we had a couple of victories for the Union in the west side by the Mississippi. Remember, the goal is to get the Mississippi River. So in 1862, there's a battle at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and Union troops under Ulysses S. Grant, make sure you remember that name, he captured the 2 Tennessee forts. He is a great leader. He knows the game. He is a great soldier, and he captured the 2 Tennessee forts from the Confederacy. So the Union gained control of 2 areas of the Mississippi River. The Battle of Shiloh happened in 1862 for 2 days in April. The Confederate forces surprised Grant, his forces, and they drove them back towards the river. With the aid of fresh troops, Grant beat back the Confederates and won at the Battle of Shiloh. The Union now won control of the Tennessee River. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The New Orleans Battle in 1862, Union gunboats captured New Orleans and other ships captured Memphis, Tennessee. So the Union controlled both ends of the Mississippi, but there's one area that's kind of in the way for having complete control, which Grant is trying to go after. Kind of want to quickly talk about the African Americans that helped out during the Civil War. So at the time, in the Union, free African Americans and escaped slaves enlisted into the Union Army. They wanted to help out. At first, it was kind of against the law for them to enlist, and then that law went away. And at first, black troops only served as laborers or cooks or building roads or cleaning or guarding supplies. But in 1863, African American troops were fighting in battles. They were helping out. And one of the most famous units was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. In 1863, this regiment led an attack on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina, near that area. They fought a great fight. They were very brave, but majority of them died in that attack. They fought their way into the fort before they were forced to retreat. The bravery of the soldiers helped win respect for African American soldiers. Behind Confederate lines, many enslaved African Americans, they slowed down work or refused to work at all to kind of diminish the South, because again, they're still enslaved. And so they would try any way they can to slow down the South in any way possible to help out the North. And whenever a Union Army soldier appeared, slaves from all over the area would cross that Union line to freedom. And at the end of the war, about 1/4 of the South's enslaved population escaped during the Civil War. I also think it's kind of important to kind of see what the life like was for a soldier. Most soldiers were under the age of 21, some 18 years old, as young as 17. As the death toll rose, the South drafted boys as young as 17 and men as old as 50. The normal range for the draft, because the North and South had a draft trying to enlist men, and it was ages 21 to 45. But the South started getting younger men and older men to help. One way that men could get out of the draft was they'd pay $300 or they would have someone else volunteer for them. So the rich men were able to pay their way out and not fight in the Civil War. And many of the working class or poor who were drafted because they couldn't afford the $300, they called this the rich man's war. The rich got away with it. They were forced to fight, and it's the poor man's fight. New technology added to the horror of war. There are various different bullets that are created, guns, cannons, better weapons, equal better accuracy, and it is very obvious during this war that new technology is deadly and it causes more death because the accuracy is better than it has been in the other wars. In most battles, 1/4 or more of the soldiers were killed or wounded. And if you were wounded many times, the doctors that were there, or the surgeons, would amputate your arm or leg just because. And because of the medical care back then wasn't as great as it is now, the doctors actually thought the pus that you'd have from a wound was a good sign, and many soldiers would die because that means there's an infection, and they didn't know that. So medical care on the battlefield was horrible, wasn't good, it wasn't sanitary. The surgeons amputated injured arms and legs, and many of those injured arms and legs that were amputated, you get gangrene, and that'd be horrible. And sanitary conditions were poor. Nothing was known about germs or how wounds become infected with not taking care of it. And diseases like pneumonia, malaria killed more men than guns or cannons. More men died during this war because of illnesses and diseases than actual gunfire. I also want to look at the women's role during the Civil War, what their role was. So many men gone to war, leaving their families, leaving their homes. Women took jobs in industries and on farms to help pay and keep their family afloat. And women, they also aided societies, and they helped supply the troops with food, bedding, clothing, medicine. They held fundraisers to pay for war supplies in the North. Women also worked as nurses, and they kind of set the path for women being on the battlefields, helping and being nurses for the people that are injured. Dorothea Dix, who we know, who was an advocate for prison reform and for the mentally ill, she and Clara Barton became nurses for the Union Army and helped out. Clara Barton, fun fact, she actually founded the American Red Cross. And the Red Cross, if you don't know, it's still around today. It helps people that experience a natural disaster. So if there's a hurricane, the Red Cross comes out and helps give them food, water, shelter, clothing, or if there's a forest fire or a flood, etc., or helps out the homeless and seniors too. She founded that. And Clara Barton, she was an advocate to be on the battlefield and help out and be a nurse. And Sojourner Truth, who we know was all about the women's rights and the abolition movement, she escaped slavery and she changed her name to Sojourner Truth because she was going to speak the truth about slavery. She worked in Union hospitals. Sally Tompkins set up a Confederate hospital and helped out the Confederate troops. So I just wanted to show you kind of what the women's role was. They took on jobs, they became nurses, they helped out too during the war. Alright, so remember I said previously how Grant was trying this one last area to gain full control of the Mississippi River. Well, this is the area and the victory that Grant is going to get. And it's called the Battle of Vicksburg. It starts on May 22nd to July 4th, 1863. And I'm going to explain why this battle went on for so long. So the synopsis of this battle was Grant's forces tried to take over and seize Vicksburg. It's a city that's on a cliff that's above the Mississippi River. And they wanted to take this city because people that were up on the cliffs, the Confederate soldiers, they can shoot down anyone that's passing the Mississippi River. That's a Union soldier. So remember, the Union has both accesses now to the Mississippi River. They took control, but they can't send people or troops down because of Vicksburg, because the Confederates could just shoot them down. And Grant, he tried time and time again to seize Vicksburg. So Grant came up with this idea, and he decided he was going to march inland instead of going on the Mississippi River to attack. He was going to march inland and attack Vicksburg from the behind. And Grant's forces, they laid a siege, which, if you don't know what a siege is that they encircle the entire city and they kind of blockade it where people in that city can't come and go. They cut off food supplies to them, pretty much like to starve them out. And they lay siege to the city, they encircle it, they blockade it, and they bombard it. And their goal is Vicksburg, the Confederate soldiers, need to surrender so they can take control. And finally, the Confederates, they surrendered the city because the supplies, they were out. They were starving because it's from May 22nd to July 4th. It's a long time. And it was about 6 weeks that the siege was happening. And the Confederates finally surrendered the city to the Union forces. And now the Union forces have complete control of the Mississippi River, which was one of their plans, one of their strategies. And it split the Confederacy down the middle. In Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, they didn't have any access to the Confederacy anymore because of the Union controlling the Mississippi River. And because of this helped boost hope in the North, in the Union, that, hey, we might win this. And another battle that I'm going to talk about that Union kind of, like, it changes the war because the Union realizes, hey, we might win this, and they're getting some confidence, and they're planning better, they're having better people in charge. And this battle is probably one of the most famous battles of the Civil War. Is called the Battle of Gettysburg. This happened June 30th to July 2nd, 1863. So 2 days before the Confederates surrendered at Vicksburg. So General Lee of the Confederacy, he wanted to surprise Union forces at Gettysburg. So he brought his troops up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which is a small town in Pennsylvania. And on the first day of this battle, the Confederates, they won. They drove the Union forces out of Gettysburg. And the Union forces were like, we're not going to have that. So on the second day, Lee's forces attacked the ends of the Union line, but the line held. So the Union forces were like along this line. It's kind of hard to talk about without you seeing it. And they held that line when the Lee's forces came. And so they retreated. The third day, Lee was like, we're going to try one more time. He's like, let's try one more time. So he ordered General George Pickett to lead what's called the Pickett's Charge. He had George Pickett lead 15,000 men in a daring charge against the center of that Union line. And the Union line was along this hill all the way to Cemetery Ridge is where the Union troops were. It was a nice line, and they were staying put. So Lee, putting in a gamble, he had George Pickett lead 15,000 men charging straight to that center of that Union line to hopefully break the line and kind of swoop around and go to D.C. and kind of capture that. The last attack of the Battle of Gettysburg, like I said, is known as Pickett's Charge. So row after row of Confederate soldiers were shot down. They kept charging that line of Union troops, and they were shot down. And because of that, they lost so many men. Lee lost so many men at this war. So his forces had to retreat. The Confederates would never invade the North again. They decided, we're not doing that. And this was a huge victory for the North, even though they lost many people too. So we're getting towards the end of the war, and Grant's now in charge of the Union Army, as he's kind of paved his way as a good leader, and Lincoln chose him. And Grant had a plan to end the war. He was going to destroy the South's ability to fight by waging a total war. And a total war, it's a type of warfare in which an army destroys everything that might be helpful to the enemy. Food, equipment, shelter, even civilians are put into that effect too. And Grant sent General Philip Sheridan and his cavalry into the rich farmland of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. And they were supposed to use that total war plan to destroy everything in your path. Does not matter if it's a civilian, soldier, house, equipment, food, destroy it so we can cut off the South. And Sheridan destroyed farms, livestock, and barns filled with grain for food. And Grant also ordered General William Tecumseh Sherman to capture Atlanta, Georgia, then march all the way to the Atlantic coast, so going east. And along the way, again, you're using the total war plan. And Sherman, after he captured Georgia pretty easily, he burned a large part of Atlanta. Then his army began what's called the March to the Sea. He destroyed everything. Railroad tracks. He'd burn them, and he'd bend them around a tree. Livestock, fields, barns, homes, bridges, factories, anything he destroyed. Most of the South properties were destroyed. They didn't want the Confederates, once this war was done, to go home to a home. The homes were destroyed. And many people did not like that. They kind of called Grant a butcher. But Grant had to do what he had to do to win the war. He was going to do anything. It did not matter. It was a business, that was his plan. Many people did not like it, though. They kind of thought of him as a barbarian or a butcher. Alright, so the Civil War ends. Lee and his army were trapped by Union troops at this small town in Virginia called Appomattox Courthouse. And Lee knew his troops were going to be killed no matter what if they kept fighting. So on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant. And Grant was pretty nice with his terms of surrender. He wasn't going to imprison them because Lincoln told him to be generous with his terms of surrender. That's what Lincoln wanted, and that's what Grant wanted. The soldiers were required to turn over their rifles. They were allowed to keep their pistols. Soldiers who had horses were able to keep them. And Grant ordered that each officer and man would be allowed to return to his home, not to be disturbed by the United States authorities. And they had to pretty much devote that they were going to not rebel again, that they were going to be loyal to the U.S. And Lee was okay with that term. And the Union troops were actually celebrating after the surrender, and Grant cut that out real quick. He said, we're not cheering. These men are our countrymen again. We are now brothers again. We're no longer fighting each other. Alright, so I'm going to give you a little statistics of the Civil War. So the Civil War resulted in almost as many deaths as the total of all other American wars combined. 620,000 deaths. 1 in every 5 military men that fought in the Civil War died in service. Of 620,000 men who died, about 340,000 were from the North, and about 280,000 from the South. And again, brother versus brother were fighting each other during this war. Caused a lot of pain, money, sacrifice, and hopefully this helped. Have a great week. Love you all.